Thank you again for joining us, Brian, Stephen. It's great to see you. Great to see you in person. For the rest of those joining online, this will be another really exciting and great discussion. I believe we could go on forever, but I believe to keep it a little bit structured, we will try to stay in the arms of these two great individuals who have a very broad background. I would let Brian and Stephen introduce themselves, but just my professional, experience with them have been phenomenal. Especially, we work together on the M&A side and the technology partnership side with Stephen. Stephen, welcome back from Augusta. We meet again, and we said we're going to do this, so we are doing it. It's short 6 months to get to an MVP of a Cyber Talent Week, which we believe will be a steady and a kind of recurring a calendar event for us in coming years. Brian, thank you for joining us for the first time, I think, in live in person. So it's good to see the 3D version of the 2D that we have typically done. So why don't we just start with the introduction, Brian? You probably go, and then we'll go with Stephen.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me, Val. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Levine. I'm Managing Director of EY's Transaction, Cybersecurity, and Data Privacy Group. So this is a group of 40 cybersecurity and data privacy geeks that just focus on transactions. So we typically get involved in the diligence phase, and we've done over 1,000 cybersecurity and data privacy due diligences. And then we'll continue on and assist with the integration, or in a divestiture, the separation or stand up of a new security organization. We also work on IPO readiness and other types of transactions. And I myself am a non-traditional consultant. I actually joined EY 3 years ago from the US Department of Justice, where I was a cybercrime prosecutor and national coordinator for the other 300 cybercrime prosecutors around the country. Prior to that, I was a regulator with the New York Attorney General's office in their Internet and Technology Bureau. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years doing technology litigation with some big law firms, Morrison & Foerster in Palo Alto, better known as MoFo, and Paul Weiss in New York, which is another good firm, but has no funny abbreviation. So that's me. And I've had the pleasure working with Stephen on a variety of different projects. So just pleased to be here and meeting Stephen in person for the first time.
Oh, thanks. It's nice to see everyone in 3D. You know, for the past 2 years, it's been Zoom in 2D. And I'll tell you, it's just not the same seeing folks in person. And so Stevenson, Global Vice President, Mergers, Acquisitions, Divestitures. And I represent Zscaler, industry leader in zero trust cloud security platforms. And you may be wondering, wait a second, how does M&A play into a software as a service platform? And what we've been doing is helping our clients accelerate their transactions. And if you think about a transaction, as Brian eloquently mentioned, integration, a separation, a carve-out, a joint venture, there's an incredible amount of risk, cost, complexity, and talent required to make this successful. And many of the best practices were developed over 20 years ago. And if you look at these playbooks, they're the exact same ones being followed today. And if you take a look at those clients, they've actually taken a leap forward. They're no longer doing on-premise solutions, they're doing something in the cloud. Their entire direction is based upon cloud service platforms and also software as a service platform. Why is their most important business process not in the cloud? And that's what we do. We help to create that transformation from being on-prem to a cloud-based solution in a draconian way that reduces time, cost, and complexity that has never been seen before. So it's a transformational program. And if you think about transformations, we always like talking about business transformation, digital transformation. The foundation of it is, how do you grow your business? How do you manage your costs? How do you bring value to your shareholders? That's what we help our clients do. And background, more than a decade running global IT organizations in the financial services industry, engineering, architecture, operations, and security, and then also a decade of management consulting as well. So Val, it's been a pleasure to meet you and looking forward to the conversation today.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And if those who know me from my background at EY and prior to that, other places, you can't think of Val just operating alone. And this is the amazing team that we worked with, right? And all the client transaction, and there have been so many of them in the last few years. I always had a call into Brian, and you know, up until very recently with Stephen and all, to see how we can accelerate those, how we can create more capacity to support more. I mean, of course, that's what the business is all about. And you can imagine how much they bring to you know, their personal self and their experience and knowledge but also the teams that come with it, right? So I think talking about cyber talent in this particular space becomes more critical every day with the transaction world. And particularly in cyber, I think it will be relatable because in cyber we are probably looking at a place where there's be a lot of integration coming up, and that brings another opportunity for us to engage and increase. So let me start off with one maybe simple question about how is M&A and cyber related in terms of the journey to an integration or a divestiture? And Brian, let me start with you.
Yeah, so when we think of cybersecurity for M&A, there's two major risks that an acquirer is taking on when they do a transaction. The first is counterparty risk, and that risk is that the company that they're looking to acquire is already infected with malware, has already been compromised, or is non-compliant with data privacy regulations, or their maturity around cybersecurity and data privacy is just so low that it's only a matter of time before they are compromised if it's not current. That's the counterparty risk. And the common examples that we hear about that, the big public examples, though there are many smaller examples that nobody talks about, Marriott's acquisition of Starwood. So when Marriott acquired Starwood, it was not aware that Starwood was already breached. Marriott acquired it, integrated it, began integrations at least, and then discovered that both organizations were now compromised. And it's ended up costing Marriott hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to deal with that issue. And litigation is still ongoing through the courts. Another similar example is when Verizon, through an entity called Oath, acquired Yahoo. Thankfully, prior to closing that acquisition, it became known that Yahoo was breached. And it was a major breach of all the email accounts, Yahoo email, my wife uses it, and some people in our audience use it. And so what Verizon was able to do was reduce the acquisition price by $350 million. But what they were also able to do was get Yahoo to create a surviving entity called Altaba, which nobody's heard of because it just exists to bear some of the responsibility for this breach. So they had to capitalize this entity. And so far, the Delaware Chancery Court, which has been overseeing this, has found that the liability from that breach alone may exceed $2.7 billion. So it was a really good thing they caught that before the acquisition went through. So that's the counterparty risk. But then the other risk, and this is the one we're seeing very commonly these days, is the transaction risk. And that's the risk that the transaction itself draws the attention of the cyber criminals and or the regulators, but we're primarily talking about the cyber criminals here. And upon announcement, what we're seeing is that both companies to the transaction get pummeled with attacks, especially ransomware attacks. And it's usually the target company, the one that's being acquired, that has the less mature cybersecurity environment, in my experience, and they often end up becoming infected with ransomware prior to close or at some point during the transaction process. The FBI issued a warning about this in November of last year, and the Wall Street Journal issued a report on it just March 1st, just last month. Because it's become so common. So we're focused on these two risks when it comes to cybersecurity, and these risks continue not just during the diligence phase, but during the integration as well. So the important point is to think about these risks early, get as much information as you can during the diligence phase, and think of how you can reduce risk throughout the integration phase, potentially through working with Stephen.
Yeah. That's a great lead in, Brian. And Brian's talked about a couple of mega deals, and there were mega deals going on all the time. The Johnson & Johnson divestiture, the General Electric divestiture. Everyone's heard about Microsoft, Activision. Those are the ones that get the biggest notoriety. But you know what's interesting? Last year was an anomaly, but there were over 61,000 transactions. 61,000 transactions, which means there's buyers and sellers on both sides. 122,000 companies were at risk. And that's where it gets to be really interesting. We think about why cybersecurity is so important. Whether it's around the analysis in advance during due diligence, the level of risk, both on a perimeter and internally, financial, organizationally, technically. Where we typically get involved is post-closure. And how do you quickly bring these companies together? What once took 2 or 3 years, you're looking for deal synergies measured in quarters and months. So whenever you can reduce that time, you increase the valuation of the asset, but also you incur incremental risk. What are some of those common things we're seeing during integration? During an acquisition, the CIO, the CISO are sometimes the last to find out during an actual integration. And that's really troubling because the deal's been closed. Oh, by the way, they just assumed full risk for the asset that was acquired they know nothing about. And when they look at that asset and they perform the necessary post-closure due diligence, they realize that, wow, we didn't acquire just a bunch of developers. We acquired an entire e-commerce environment. E-commerce environment made up of 10,000 servers. Those 10,000 servers haven't been patched in over 5 years, and they are compromised. Another example would be as they've actually done their diligence and started to bring these assets together, when you think about the legacy integration techniques of forcing two companies to be integrated together, time, cost, money, and risk. That technique doesn't apply to the future of our industry, which is around zero trust, minimum entitlements. But when you force those environments together, you now suddenly incur elevated levels of risk. What if by chance, hypothetically, one of those assets you acquired, as you're doing initial analysis, realize that they have, a Bitcoin miner sitting on one of the devices. And you didn't know that necessarily prior to acquisition. And you start doing your due diligence and you realize, oh, wait a second, it's not just a Bitcoin miner, you've got malware. And typically it's been spread across a flat environment or a VPN-based environment. And suddenly you're starting to realize there's an awful lot of money that's needed to mitigate this risk. So that's one around integration. Second is divestitures. Love it. Absolutely brilliant space because that's where you get maximum value. Typically carve out an asset to make sure that the company does what it does best, focusing on its core business. When you create that separation, though, you have a TSA agreement between two parties at the end of the day, the originator and the carve-out asset. And usually their service is still being rendered for a period of time. And because trust is required between two separating parties, it's all based upon risk, compliance, governance, and cybersecurity. It is the foundation that we're seeing in divestitures, carve-outs, joint ventures, and shared IP today. So cybersecurity is the foundation of what we're seeing for successful transactions. By the way, in my opening statement, I forgot to mention, of those 61,000 transactions, more than 70% are deemed as not successful. That's an incredibly high failure rate for something that's so critical for the transformation of most major companies out there today.
Absolutely. And I think, you laid down so many steps on the way, so many elements that need to be considered. And remind me again how many people are in this space, right? I think that the M&A space really needs more attention so that the at-risk companies from both sides, as you mentioned, 122,000 of them, and we probably see the surface of it. Of course, the bigger ones that can come together to bring this risk down, right? Stephen, maybe I come to you in terms of the how do you break it down, and where does technology play a role, and then we'll come down to where does the professionals play a role in that.
Where do they come into play? A transaction is a business process, which requires aptitude, expertise, methodologies, approaches, and professionals. We're noticing in some of our largest clients, they have their own internal organizations that help specialize in this: corporate strategy, corporate development, integration, separation management offices. A lot of the time, though, they don't have that muscle because they're not serial acquirers, serial divestors, where they turn to someone like Brian and Brian's practice to help make sure that methodology and muscle is in place. We sort of view ourselves as being an enabler and an accelerator. Once again, how do you take dramatic cost out? Transactions that used to take 2 years can now be done in 2 months. The very best do them in 2 weeks. How do you take out cost in a very meaningful manner? Because at the end of the day, an integration or separation is what's based upon synergy savings. What do you return back to the shareholders as part of this integration separation? That's also key. But the biggest one is risk. How do you manage risk? And how do you make sure you can measure it and then reduce it? And often, much of that risk was being kicked down the road, being something that addressed after closure. If you can address it up front, that's where the technology providers really can make a difference. But it's based upon partnerships with folks like Brian and his practice. You have a strategy, an architecture, a best practice for integration, separation. The technology makes it as enabler, but the key theme is the thought leadership that you guys provide.
Oh, that's nice of you, Stephen. No, but I agree. I mean, like technology is both the source of the problem and it's part of the solution. It's a source of the problem in that you have technology that can be has vulnerabilities and it can be overwhelmed by cyber attacks and other kinds of attacks. But at the end of the day, it's professionals on both sides that are going to really be able to make the difference in a transaction. So when we think about a transaction, it's not just about trying to have the best security possible. You know, you can always spend more on security. That's a problem that we see across transactions. Companies are usually looking to buy smaller companies, and they're thinking, that smaller company, well, they really don't have much security, especially compared to us. You know, we have a Cadillac program. And, you can always spend more. You can always add additional tools, additional technology. So what you need with professionals is to help understand what are the actual risks and what are the costs and where are the synergies and how can I get the best return on investment in terms of this acquisition generally, or this divestiture generally, and the security. Because you could put an extra $1 million into security and improve security by 1%, but is it worth it potentially? So this is sort of an unusual space, and when you think in terms of talent, and because professionals, because you need people who are not just expert technologists, but you need people who have that judgment and business acumen who can kind of combine that with the technology and with the technical background.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think, both of those weigh in, and probably I can share a quick anecdote. You mentioned a certain Divestiture, which I was, and EY was like intricately involved. Some of that is public now, we can probably speak and painfully recollect what happens when you have such massive changes in organizations, right? I think one big risk that we see, and personally I can share from my experience, is that there is a lot of flight risk at that time, especially the bigger ones, bigger organizations. When you have divestitures or changes in transactions, people have immediately this place is going to change. I'm going to new boss, a new company, going to be a different culture. I'm going to go find a new job or do something. And that is exactly what we dealt with. Those divestitures. I mean, literally 50% of the cybersecurity company team just left.
Yeah.
And then we had to come in and then backfill a lot of that, but that makes that even more harder, right? So what is your guidance for transactions as related to people and their opportunities within those transactions?
Yeah, so I gotta say, what you're talking about is the minimal threat there, which is that people just leave and now you have to refill some key positions. But the bigger risk is around transaction is people leave and become insider threats.
Yes.
They're going to take everything that's not nailed down, not necessarily because they're being malicious, but because they don't know what's going to be useful in their next job or where they're going, and they don't know if they're going to be fired or they're going to be just see a better opportunity, but they're nervous. And I'll tell you, when I was with the Department of Justice, I dealt with a very serious insider theft case. One company acquired another company. It was a much smaller company. And when they acquired this smaller company, which was in Europe, a fairly senior engineer who had something like 20 direct reports was, at least in his mind, demoted as a part of the restructuring. And he was very, let's just say, disgruntled as a result. So the company, he was able to access the parent company, the acquiring company's central software repository, and download all of their source code to all of their products, and then left with that and went to the company's primary customer in China. And once that big, large customer in China had the source code, they no longer needed this company. And it was a public company, so they had to announce what happened publicly. And as a result, the stock price dropped $1.2 billion pretty much overnight. And they had to lay off 70% of their global workforce. So it pretty much killed this company. Yeah. So while that's hopefully not going to happen in every instance, you really have to think about the people when you're doing these transactions and what you can do to reduce the insider threat and the talent issues around that. It can be significant.
Everything you said, spot on. What we've noticed in addition to the insider threat is the unknown, which is the third-party access, which I believe is the greatest threat right now during any transaction or to any enterprise or public sector entity today. If you don't know who's connecting to your environment, you've created elevated levels of risk. And think about the simple backdoor example Brian gave. Once an acquisition has been announced, it is all hands on deck for any malicious behavior to go after the acquired asset. It is the path of least resistance to get into the originator. That is, I think, the number one thing we're noticing, but it's also in a very subtle way. Ask yourself, how many third-party access providers do you have, and how many users within those firms have access? It's not measured in dozens, hundreds, thousands. If you're outsourced, tens of thousands. The level of risk is unprecedented for not just insider threats, but those that you permit for third-party access. And when you acquire an access and you force these two companies together using legacy methodologies, you've just opened the kimono to having all of your IP and data and financials stolen. So it's a huge risk. Can I call an audible for a second on a topic?
Sure.
No, thanks. Before we walked on stage, Brian and I were talking, and I always like to think about a discussion like this. What's in it for you? And what's in it for our audience, especially for the students that are out there today? And when I graduated from college, comp sci, mathematics degree, spent way too much time coding over those 4 years to have 12 different languages and saying, oh my gosh, the rest of my life, I'm going to be sitting in front of a TNT 3270 session writing code on a mainframe. I got to tell you, it is so different out there today. And Brian and I are just a little bit different. If you're thinking about your career as a computer scientist or a cybersecurity specialist, and by the way, I'm still amazed, it's only the 9th most popular degree out there today. We need to figure out to raise some visibility to this space. What we do is actually just a derivative of what we've learned in our careers. And cybersecurity and IT is really deeply embedded within business process. So we've just elevated over our time. So the key theme for those that are moving into cybersecurity or to comp sci, it is the beginning of your career, and you're going to have an incredible number of journeys. Many of my former associates have moved off to the cloud environments, moving over to software as a service providers, doing their own startups. There's a lot more than just architecture, engineering, and operations. As you heard from Brian, Brian's an attorney. I mean, whoever thought they actually would have an attorney focused upon cybersecurity?
Not I.
Some of the interesting things we're seeing today, areas within the business units focused upon customer protection. Customer protection, think about it. You're a CIO, not for the internal organization. You're the CISO for your customers. And are you meeting their security requirements from data privacy and from security mitigation? It's brilliant how far the cybersecurity industry has evolved. So once again, key theme, when I graduated from college, cybersecurity was a class. It was cryptography. And now it's an entire career. And it's not just going out there being an architect or an engineer or operations. It's in professional services, it's in legal, it's in startups, it's in SaaS providers, it's in cloud providers. Your career is unprecedented. And somehow we have to get that story out there. There's a lot more to cybersecurity than just what people think. Thank you.
Well said.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
No, I think that is a message that needs to get out, and more people need to consider the different pathways to cyber career. I mean, we tried to put spotlight on a few, like one of them was incident response, which I believe is a big area which is needing a lot of attention now, and also critical infrastructure security, specific areas where steady state cybersecurity gets done. But you live in the dynamic space where things are moving, right?
Yeah.
And that's that's the next level of cyber by itself is dynamic, and then you're moving at the speed of a transaction, which the both parties want to close then, right? Tell me, Brian, let me ask you about a little bit of timeline of those transactions, how fast things move.
Yeah, things move very fast in the transaction space. When we're asked to look into the cybersecurity company as part of a cybersecurity due diligence, the average time period that we have to do that is 2 weeks, I would say. It can be shorter. It can be 1 week. Once I had to do it in 4 days. If we have a lot of time, it could be 3 or 4 weeks, but this is not a lot of time to get to know the cybersecurity of a company, which may itself have a number of acquisitions that have different environments that haven't fully been integrated. You also have to realize when you're looking at the cybersecurity of a company for an acquirer, they're not, the target company is not necessarily 100% cooperating with you. So it's not one of these situations where you can just walk the halls and, you know, stick in your thumb drive and check the servers, do a, you know, install your own EDR and understand exactly what's there. So you're having not the most reliable sources of information. So for example, what we're doing, we're looking at all of their documentation that they're willing to provide. That could be thousands of documents in a very short period of time. We're conducting interviews with management, but we're also doing outside-in kind of diligence to sort of kick the tires using open source intelligence, dark web research, and some proprietary techniques to sort of understand what are the actual risks there. And then I think probably the biggest, or one of the biggest challenges, to go to Stephen's theme about people looking for careers in this field, is that ultimately, who are we explaining this story to about what is the cyber risk of this company? Not technologists. We're explaining this to corporate development people. We're explaining it to business people, C-suite people who don't really understand that much about technology, who are not cybersecurity experts, and who don't use half of the words that my team uses. So, you know, one of the things that I think is sort of underappreciated as people are coming up into the cybersecurity field is the importance of developing strong communication skills and being able to explain both orally and in writing to anybody, what are the risks, how significant are they, and how can they be mitigated?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, being in on a transaction call, which is you've got like an hour and maybe 90 minutes at max, you got 10 minutes to distill down every finding you have. And within those 10 minutes, you have to tell what is the highest thing, highest risk that they can action on and what needs to be parked, right? Because transaction, though, you know, that phase is like our phase with them that is probably a month or two, but there is a transaction, and there's a post, and Stephen mentioned about TSAs, which can go on after, like, even if you don't want it, a TSA can be a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, right?
Typically.
Typically. So let's pivot to a little bit of on the technology side, Stephen. You know, Zscalers fits in this very convenient box now, I would say, where you can actually make all of this abstracted to a different level. So you don't have to go inside. Everything is abstracted at a network level. And when you change, you can change over and the visibility remains the same, right? So you don't looking at what are the innovation areas in this space where we can leverage the intensity of work that Brian does from a human scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Two thoughts on that one. You know, what's interesting is there's a great article in Forbes just a few weeks ago about how cybersecurity now is a board of director discussion. And they're now measuring a board's capability to manage risk by the level of accreditation of cybersecurity sitting in that board. That is a really different conversation than having a financial conversation or one around HR. And it's nice to see it's being elevated, and it's giving many CISOs and C-suites an opportunity to be represented or have a seat at the table. And I think they're now coming back and saying, wait a second, since I am representing cybersecurity at the board level, I need to think like a business person. And as a business person, as you mentioned, Val, you know, 3 themes really make a lot of sense. Anytime you can reduce time to complete a transaction, you're increasing valuation of that transaction, increasing shareholder value. Number 2, when you can take out or have value capture, taking that necessary cost out. I mentioned metaphorically before, when you did a transaction, it took multiple years, you typically would be acquiring an entire new asset and doubling your investment for a one-time integration or a one-time separation. It doesn't make logical sense anymore. That's not how it's done. And then third is just the time and the risk. So whenever you can take that physical asset, you can highly virtualize it into a zero trust environment and protect your most atomic units. Your most atomic units are your users and your data. And you stitch them together in a zero trust model. and then put in place the appropriate security controls so that it's auditable and controllable, it's game changing. Brian was talking about time, one of my favorite client discussions, an anonymous one around a Fortune 50 company. Picked up a phone call in November 2 years ago and said, hey, listen, we have to complete our divestiture and split apart this asset. It's November, middle of the month, and we've committed to the shareholders. It'll be finished by the end of Q1. So roughly we had about 2 months to wrap it up. A typical divestiture we've done in the past, this is a 2-year journey. Planning, preparation, just to meet day one change of control. Working with them in this new approach of using a highly virtualized model, connecting your most important atomic units, which is your apps and your users, and being able to pull them apart virtually within an environment, make sure the appropriate controls are in place, and then say by day one it's auditable, was game changing. What once would have taken 2 years, we finished in about 6 weeks. And now that company's been stood up without having to purchase all that extra equipment, co-locations, hardware, software, and distracting their resources. Most important thing is the resources. I'm going to go back to it once again. What's amazing about the world that we live in today is that when you do a transaction, it becomes very mundane. It's a repeatable process. There's a playbook, and these playbooks are 20 years old, and they have been modernized since. Therefore, whenever you do a transaction, the muscle isn't as strong as it should be. So most enterprises are actually pulling their best and brightest resources from infrastructure, cloud, cybersecurity, HR, et cetera, away from their digital transformation journey of going cloud native and pulling it back to something as mundane as doing a basic integration or a separation, impacting the future of the company's growth. So the nice thing about when you can take something and highly virtualize it, doing a transaction in the cloud, changing a business workflow, modernize an environment, and key theme, driving revenue growth, reducing cost, and managing risk, it's game changing.
Absolutely. And I think, when you combine that with the business value that needs to be retained and leveraged, I mean, that's the whole soul of transaction, right? Yeah. You're going through this divestiture or M&A because you think the value would be, increased or the risk would be decreased. So let me pivot a little bit towards the skills that are required, and how can technology skills and professional skills come together to make this even better and more efficient? Brian, start with you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the M&A space, you clearly need both in order to really be successful with respect to cybersecurity. And to pick up on Steven's theme, the Forbes article was occasioned by the fact that the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, recently proposed regulation that would apply to all SEC registrants, so all SEC, all public companies, that would require certain disclosures related to governance and related to board expertise, as Stephen mentioned. And so these issues are necessarily, if these rules go forward, going to percolate and become more important at the C-suite level, at the board level, at the business level. And it's not just the SEC and it's not just public companies. In general, regulators are more focused in this space. The New York Department of Financial Services, the White House, courts, Treasury, all have made it clear that they're very focused on this space. And so one of the things that we need from cybersecurity professionals these days is sort of an understanding of the regulatory landscape, the GRC. It's important. So, and I'm not just saying that because I have a legal background, but so much of this area is now regulated. Talk about data privacy regulations alone. It was GDPR initially in Europe. Now, virtually every country has their own version of GDPR, and they're all different. In the United States, it started with California with CCPA, and now every other state is coming up with their own similar but somewhat different version of that. Every state has a breach law. The breach laws are different in all states. Some have their own cybersecurity regulations. Different industries have their own cybersecurity regulations. So how do you deal with that huge tapestry of law and regulation, as well as the common law, which sits below all of it? And how do you make sensible decisions in light of that? And with court decisions coming out on a daily basis, which I post on LinkedIn. So if you're not linked in with me, please feel free to link in. But in any event, so part of it is that. Part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, communication. I think that's increasingly important because of these broad regulations and business people being more involved in this area. Cybersecurity professionals from the beginning needs to work on their communication skills. And how can they do that? Let's be practical here. Even things as basic as doing public speaking classes, Toastmasters, taking improv classes, just get some of these people out from behind their computers, behind their keyboards, and practice speaking in normal language that normal people can understand. So I think the communication is really important. I think understanding the regulatory landscape, I think building up judgment is very important. And so I think it goes well beyond some of the hard skills and the programming and the technology skills that used to be at the forefront of cybersecurity. I think now that's the foundation, but we have to go way beyond that.
Absolutely, and taking the story forward is absolutely necessary, because we are all taking gigs at heart, but that can only get us so much. And then thanks for mentioning the LinkedIn. I really honestly think following Brian, you get to learn so much, and especially the case studies that you do for the litigations as they go, and some of them are live, some of them are post. It's a great learning resource. So thank you for putting it out there. I know like what kind of time, kind of professional life you live, and taking time to do that is really commendable.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So Stephen, building on that, I think there are certain skills that our professional services would need, and you need to be a really thorough professional to actually distill everything down to a few weeks of transaction. But that, I think, also relies now more than ever before on the technical skills, right? To be able to understand what needs to be decoupled, what cannot be decoupled, and over what time. Not everybody has, and hopefully get to Zscaler, but I believe in how do you break it down from a technological lens?
Sure. That's a great question. PSA, first of all, for all of the students that are out there today, if you have a chance to work with a management consulting firm in the technology consulting space, don't think twice, do it. It will change your DNA for life of how you think about a problem. And it's less about learning the features and functions, it's the methodology to go after it. And you will use this for the rest of your career. And to me, it's critical that we do more of this, pardon the metaphor, critical thinking, inductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, not just as a management consultant, but also in college and also in high school. It carries you and it changes your viewpoint going forward. Now, when I think about transactions, and once again, there's every single ounce of technology you can imagine during an integration or separation. Keep it simple. Many of you hopefully have gone through some type of cloud certification program, whether it's Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Oracle, Alibaba, and IBM. It's brilliant what they've given to you for free. When we started our careers and I wanted to stand up a non-prod environment, I'd have to spend 3 months and who knows how many tens of thousands of dollars on servers, storage, network, security equipment, and that's just getting for a first instance proof of concept so I can build the application. You can build an entire environment in a single VPC on Amazon for pennies on the dollar. And I think that's where the beauty of it is today for the students that are out there today trying to change the trajectory of their career. They can learn application security. They can learn DevSecOps. They can learn how to do a CI/CD. They can learn how to do network security, which is incredibly important, but balance it out though with infrastructure security as well, tying it into a real-time monitoring system. And then also, what's the demise of every single security operations leader today? You've got too many data streams coming in. You've got a million feeds, events, alerts, and alarms coming in every day. You don't have a solution, you have a problem. So suddenly you can use analytics to your favor. So the thing that we look for, those that are really orthogonal, how can you apply this across an environment? It's less about the vendor, it's about being able to provide a full solution for that technical problem. Because actually that's what an integration and separation happens to be. If you take a look at how we used to do it, used to have an army of architects, engineers, operations, and then we have PMO groups doing these integrations and separations. Guess what? Today, I need a full stack engineer, I need a site reliability engineer, and let them go nuts. That's how you run a business, and tie it into a DevSecOps model. This is game changing. But once again, we're pulling together these very esoteric concepts, which today are stitched together around enterprise IT, but now we're applying it to a business process. So we're transforming it in real time. And the key theme Brian brought up earlier today, transactions don't wait for you. When you see more than 1,000 transactions a week, and some of our clients do 60 transactions a year, 60. Think about it. If it takes them 18 months to finish a transaction, they still haven't finished what they started in 2019, and it's the year 2022. So time is money. So I think the key theme is here, the fewer the resources, the more talented the resources, the better you can virtualize and take these physical concepts and put them in a cloud, the faster you have time to value.
Absolutely. And I'll just extend that and say that, from the initial concept that Stephen mentioned about getting hands-on experience, I cannot overemphasize that. And I'll tell you, this is probably, being a nonprofit, I can say this loudly, that the cost of running an organization like CFF, guess how much? Infrastructure cost. I'm not talking about the overall program cost and all that we do together. Infrastructure costs, it's still in 3 digits. 3 digits. And we're what, 6,000 people, around 40 countries, all dispersed, and all of the collaboration, everything is a few $100s. And we couldn't add, if it were like 10 years back, I don't think we could have afforded this, right? And all the people who are joining together today through the platforms that we cost, all of that put together is just a few $100s. And we have the luxury that we didn't have earlier now. So I shameless plug, but I would do this. Just go if you want to do an internship at CFF, please do, because that would give you a lot of hands-on experience on what we do, how to run a business, and how the components and all of this plug together. And if there's anything that we can do for Stephen, both you and Brian, in terms of getting people ready and hands-on, we would do that in a heartbeat. Because I think it would be really helpful to get the students the real world experience of a transaction.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
We'll take you up on that.
Oh, please do. Well, I got a few minutes to close here. And I wanted to just get your kind of final thoughts around what would you suggest the entry-level students and candidates who are career transitioning it. I think those are the 2 biggest elements of our pipeline. How do you suggest they start in a M&A journey? Is there something small case study that you have, Brian, maybe in your hundreds of LinkedIn posts we can relate to?
It's a good question. I would say, when you're starting off or earlier making a transition, I think you just don't focus single-mindedly on cybersecurity or whatever it is. I would make this recommendation for anyone going into any field. If you're thinking about doing M&A, security for M&A, then you want to focus both on cybersecurity, you want to focus on business, you want to understand transactions, you want to understand organic growth and inorganic growth, and you want to understand the legal and regulatory world. So I think you need sort of a more balanced approach than sort of a singular focus if you want to do this kind of work.
And can you stitch together in entry-level folks in different areas to build one team, or does it have to be that person?
Yeah, so, we have some entry-level folks in our group who come in right from college or right from some other degree program. And yeah, they can get there over time. Certainly, people shouldn't feel like they have to have everything from their educational background. But I'm seeing more and more programs out there that are trying to stitch these things together. For example, my own alma mater for law school, NYU Law School, now has a joint law and cybersecurity degree. Yeah. I had never heard of that before. So, and I think you're going to see that more common with joint cybersecurity and business degrees, joint cybersecurity and other kinds of degrees. So I would encourage people to just look at how they can fuse these things together. I think even if they don't end up going into M&A or something specific like that, I think having sort of different experiences and bringing that to play in your main focus ends up making you very valuable.
Absolutely. No, that's great advice. Thank you so much. Stephen, your thoughts on getting people ready for it, M&A transaction space?
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny, 30 years ago, you could start your career working for one enterprise or one company and stay there till you retire. It's not like that anymore. Think about your journey in 18-month sprints. And what is it that you've done? What is it that you'd like to learn? And where would you like to be next? And everything you do is a stepping stone in your career, giving you a chance to advance personally, professionally, and then technically. I'm going to take an alternative approach to Brian because everything you said makes a lot of sense. Invest in yourself. Just because you finished high school or community college or graduated from university, you're just beginning your career. Invest in yourself. And make sure when you invest in yourself, you do it because you love it, because you'll then never work a day in your life. And I promise you, it really does feel that way in the spaces that we live in. Once again, there's good days and bad days. Hey, I'm the first to admit it. Some of the best investments I've made have been as much as pro bono work. Once again, when you have an ability to go ahead and work with the cloud service providers and for free, learn how to stand up an entire, 3-tiered web app database infrastructure for pennies on the dollar in hours. Suddenly you're learning things that we never knew about in college. Invest in yourself. One of my best investments, O'Reilly books. I'm not, once again, promoting or denoting. When you can have a chance to look and read as many books online, when we travel as much as we do, trust me, it's one of the best ways to come up to speed. Same thing with Coursera, same thing with edX. That's how you really invest in yourself. You want to take that next step in your career. And the thing I'll go back to is if you want to move into mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, start with yourself. Become an expert at something and become an expert that you can sit there and say, you know what, I put my 10,000 hours in. I really get this. I'd like to take the next step in my career and see how I can help solve a real world business problem, whether it's incident response, forensics, mergers, acquisitions, becoming an SRE, but beginning of a launch pad of your career. And every 18 months, you're reinventing yourself. We go back just a few years ago, we didn't have to reinvent ourselves everywhere. Now technology is moving so quickly that 18 months is now suddenly becoming 12 months and soon it'll be 6 months.
All right, so but just, maybe I'm old school here, but please don't change jobs every 18 months. Because I'll tell you, we see some, maybe it's old school, but we see some of these resumes of like technology people today and they've changed jobs every 18 months. And it's like, well, we want them to stay longer than that. So, because it takes a long time to get people being very effective in a particular role. So while I think I agree with you, you should think of these as short sprints, stay in the job longer than that, please, and find some way to reinvent yourself within the job before you just flee it.
Okay, that's the West Coast, East Coast mentality. But, once again, you asked the startup community 18 months, you're a dinosaur if you haven't gone public. But Brian's right, though. If you continue to reinvent yourself every 18 months, the number of career opportunities within your current company, within your industry is unprecedented. If you become stagnant, you miss out on all that fun that's going on around you. Great point.
Yeah. I think both are fair and balanced. I think, well, you have to give it to it. And for example, if you are in a farm like UI, you can move from one a particular area to another area, and you can still find things fresh to do. I mean, when I joined EY, I was literally running the whole TMT space, our telecom, media, and technology space, and they said, go do the same thing for healthcare. Did healthcare, then did energies, and they're all kind of different. And you bring learning from one place to the other, but all was under the one banner, which was great, and that can be done. But particularly with the new current young people who are coming in, I think the expectation is different. We had this conversation yesterday, Stephen, on specifically, and Brian too, in terms of the career and the cultural expectation of younger generation. As much as we are, they're anxious about getting their first job, and we are anxious to make sure that they are well accommodated. I think we have to embrace that culture of change. And that's why we have the gig now, right?
Yeah, well, I just think today in general, there's people are quick to try and solve a problem by exiting and trying something else. Like, and I don't think it's just jobs, it's like relationships too. It's like people don't want to work on the relationship, they just want to pick a different, just let me try somebody else.
Yeah.
And so I would just say, like, at EY, for example, I'm sure it's true at Zscaler, there's a lot of different things you can do before you just abandon the current plan. See what other opportunities there are within the same organization, because I think people would be surprised how many opportunities there are.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, any questions? Anybody had? I can tell you, these are like stalwarts of M&A space, especially with all the background they've got. Love to have to tap into the rent. Go ahead, Catherine.
So first of all, Brian, I do follow you on LinkedIn.
Oh, thank you.
And while I may not be a smart person, I'm really interesting at dinner parties now, the stuff I can talk with. But I have a question for both of you, because you're both great leaders. And what, in your opinion, do you believe is the impression of the cybersecurity market, our industry, in the general public, in terms of careers and what it looks like? What do you think? Do you think what we see is what the outside community sees?
That's a great question. And first of all, thank you for following me on LinkedIn. I appreciate that. It's the most important thing. So I would say, like, it depends on who, when you talk about the community, like the general community, it depends on who you think about. If you're talking about people who don't know that much about cybersecurity, what you hear is, it's like the movie The Graduate, where like plastics, right? Like that's what's to go into cybersecurity. That's the thing. And the more people know about it, the more they realize that it's a little more complicated than that, that it can be a difficult field to break into, that it's a confusing field, because, as I think a previous panelist was talking about, there's so many different vendors out there doing so many different overlapping things, and there's so many different solutions, technological, professional, so many different ways of doing this. So I think it's a great and exciting field. I think that, everybody's right. It is a good area to go into. But I think kind of the biggest thing about cybersecurity, I think that's going to make it different than maybe other fields, is the rate of change. I think, perhaps as much or more than any other field, it's going to constantly change. And if you don't like change, if you like sort of a field where it's going to be pretty much the same throughout your career, it's probably not the best one for you. And I think that in part it's because it's a constant arms race between the criminals and the cybersecurity experts. I did one case where the criminals were making, the bad guys we were going after were making hundreds of thousands of email accounts that they could use to send phishing emails. And what they did was, the company the ISP they were using thwarted them by requiring CAPTCHAs to make a new email account. So, where you have to pick the number of stop signs and things. So what they started doing was they started outsourcing to India the CAPTCHA solving. So they were paying people like 1 cent per CAPTCHA or 2 cents per CAPTCHA to solve the CAPTCHAs. And then what they did, they read a paper by a professor in the US on how AI could be used to solve CAPTCHAs. And they used the idea from the paper, and they were solving the CAPTCHAs through AI. So this was all over in the course of like a year. So I'm just talking about how quickly the cyber criminals themselves are moving, which is why cybersecurity has to move at that same rate, if not faster.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, if not motivation, then what it is, right? I mean, that's you can and should be able to stop bad guys from doing what they do for us to live the digital life that we want to live in, right? So on that note, I think we're kind of approaching the time. We called goodbye, but it would have been continuing conversation would have been great. I'm sure we'll continue beyond this, but I definitely want to see more people get into, not only cybersecurity, but really appreciate the opportunities that are in the M&A and transaction space. These numbers that Stephen, you shared, and the sheer amount of intense work that gets done at a rapid pace that Brian, you shared are hopefully going to give some really good insights to people to take up that career. So thank you again for joining us today. It's been a very informative session, and hope to build on this. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.